Hello, students in Paul's Local Theologian. This is a lecture on a short chapter by Christian Beker called that explores the coherence and contingency scheme. And what I want to do in this video lecture is really try to help you enter into this chapter, because my guess is that reading this chapter is going to feel like you are entering into a conversation at a midway point. And so I want to help you sort of enter into that conversation as effectively as possible. So I want to tease out a little bit of what Beker is saying with this chapter. I want to provide some of the broader context, because in many ways, Beker is engaging what I would call a very specialized conversation or a specialized debate within scholarship on the question of Paul as a theologian, or what kind of theologian was Paul, and is that a helpful thing to talk about with him. And then I want to outline some points of connection with what we're doing in our class and in our time together. Let me begin with just trying to sort of get you up to speed just a little bit with this conversation that you're walking in on, really, by reading this chapter. And so the first thing to note is that much of this chapter is building on his much earlier book, Paul the Apostle. And the subtitle of this book is The Triumph of God in Life and Thought. And that phrase, the triumph of God, is really, really key, because for Beker, that is sort of what is the core or central, or what he calls the coherence of Paul's understanding of the gospel. That through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God's triumph has been started or is imminently close, depending on what part of the book you're reading from. And so really what he's doing in this chapter is engaging a variety of responses to his own work on Paul as a theologian, and to other attempts to respond to his book or to think about Paul as a theologian. And really, the idea of coherence and contingency, which I will talk about in just a few minutes, is really, I think, for Beker and for many specialists in Paul, the central problem for understanding Paul as a theologian. What is consistent in Paul's thinking, and what changes given what he knows of going on in the congregation or in that part of the world, or what he's thinking or what he's experiencing. And that, I think, becomes really, really central for many specialists in Paul. What we get in this chapter is Beker engaging a broad set of questions about the nature of Paul's theology and his identity and his function as a theologian. And so that's the conversation that you're walking into. And in many ways, for this class up to this point, we have sort of barely touched on Paul at different points. And now it feels like we're, sort of took a dive off the diving board and we're in the deep end with our arms up, just trying to tread water. So that's the broader conversation that Beker is a part of. Next, I want to walk through just a few of the major important points in this chapter. I want to signal some things that I think are important for understanding what Beker is doing, and certainly for what we might be taking away from this chapter for the purposes of our class. And so I think the first large section of the chapter, basically pages 15 through 21, is Beker really re-presenting his thesis, his understanding of Paul as a theologian and what matters. And as I said earlier, coherence and contingency are central terms for understanding what Beker is trying to do. But really, although they may not use these same words, it's really, these words are central for understanding what scholars are doing, what scholarly interpretations of Paul are trying to figure out as it relates to him as a theologian. And so coherence is the first word, and this really is that which is stable and constant in Paul's thinking. He says it is the, quote, convictional basis of Paul's gospel. And he points us to places like Galatians 2:15 or Galatians 2:14, where Paul talks about the truth of the gospel. And so this is, in some other scholars, this is the core and the husk, or, sort of the central and the peripheral maybe. And so this is where Beker is saying coherence is that which is stable and that which is consistent in Paul's thinking. Now, coherence relates to what Beker calls contingency. And contingency is the variable element, that which is changing, so that we can understand that, Paul is dealing with something different in 1 Corinthians than he is in Philippians, than he is in 1 Thessalonians. And so that is the contingency. The contingencies are these variables. And so he says that the contingency describes the, quote, variety and particularity of sociological, economic, and psychological situations which Paul faces in his churches and on the mission field. So this is another way of maybe paraphrasing this is this is experience, right? What else is sociological, economic, and psychological than experience? And we've talked a lot about experience in theories of local theology. And so maybe that or context would be another way of talking about it, that the contingency is that contextual element, that local element that we've been talking about. A third thing that I think is important to understand about Beker and his representing his thesis is Paul's work as a theologian, Paul's identity, and so forth. And this, I think, is one of the very first sentences in the chapter, and it's so important. He makes the case that it's best to think of Paul not as a systematic theologian or a pastoral counselor, but as an interpreter. So not a theologian or a counselor, but as an interpreter who, quote, adapts and reformulates previous interpretation in a distinctive and innovative manner. So that, I think, is a really important point. And at least should, we can put it forward as a question, what changes about our understanding of Paul if we think of him first as an interpreter? As somebody who looks around at what's going on, what he's hearing from these congregations, what they're facing, the questions that they're asking him. And his role is not to create a treatise or a systematic theology, but his role is to provide an interpretation that is an adaptation and a reformulation of previous interpretation. That sounds a whole lot, if I'm being honest, that sounds a whole lot like what a local pastor does. It's the preaching moment, in other words. And so, again, I think that that's an important connection with our class and with Paul as a local theologian. A fourth sort of piece of the thesis. So we've talked about coherence, contingency, Paul as an interpreter. That's the third. And now the fourth is what Beker calls the heart of the matter. And he describes this as the precise character and function of Paul's interpretive activity. And what I would paraphrase that for our purposes is this is the how of Paul's theological thinking. This is the manner in which Paul goes about interpreting an event or a question or a situation through previous interpretations. So getting to the heart of the matter is paying attention to the how. Then the final piece about the sort of Beker representing his thesis is this idea of word on target. And this, if the heart of the matter is the how, the word on target is the what. This is the what of Paul's theological thinking. This is, as Beker explains it, the interaction between coherence and contingency. So in many ways, we can, I think of each of the individual letters as being a word on target. It is a word on target that balances coherence on the one hand and contingency on the other hand. So it's not just a form letter that Paul sends to one congregation or the other. It's not a pamphlet or one of these tracts that you might get on MARTA on a Saturday morning when you're riding the train. Instead, it is a really poignant and hopefully effective, although that is left for some debate, but this interaction between coherence and contingency. So that's what we get. And so I think what he gives us some language to think about is the what of theology, of Paul's theological reflection, and the how. Both the what and the how that are important. I want to turn now to just a little bit more broader context for some of what I just presented about Beker sort of revisiting the purpose of his book and some of his major arguing points in that book. And so these sort of are unpacked in the second half of the chapter that you will read. And again, because I recognize that this is a fairly technical, specialized conversation, that I want to unpack it and maybe hopefully make some connections that aren't necessarily clear in the chapter itself. And so the first is what he says. He sort of goes deeper into talking about coherence. And so he says that what he means by coherence is that it's not quite the same as a core. If by core we mean a fixed, non-pliable substance, or even the sort of center of Paul's thinking. He explains, this has been sort of the central question about Pauline scholarship and interpretation since the Reformation. And he names a few examples. So Rudolf Bultmann, a very significant, important German New Testament scholar, made this distinction between the core, like a central conviction, and the husk, a linguistic expression, the sort of manner in which it was conveyed. So for Bultmann, one of these examples of a core and a husk is about apocalyptic language or eschatological language, about the imminent return of Christ, and even some of the death and resurrection language. And so what Bultmann would say is that some of this language is antiquated. It is appropriate for the first century. It's not appropriate for the 20th century. And so what New Testament interpreters do is they sort of pull the center from this language that is foreign, perhaps, and convey it. And what Bultmann does is he says, oh, Paul is basically talking about human existence. And so that's the translation that Rudolf Bultmann does with the idea of a core and a husk. Another example is Albert Schweitzer, another important New Testament interpreter, who said that the core for Paul is this sort of eschatological mysticism, this idea of being ingrafted into Christ, that's the core, and everything else is sort of secondary or peripheral. And what Bultmann, or what Beker then clarifies, is that what he means by coherence is not fixed, but is rather a much more fluid and flexible structure. So we might think about it as a constellation of ideas or a constellation of meanings, rather than a single idea like mysticism, or a single concept like existentialism, as we see with Bultmann. And so Beker would say that Jewish apocalyptic thinking is this sort of fluid and flexible structure, that this idea that there's two ages, the present age and the future age of glory, that there's an expectation for resurrection and final judgment, and all of these things. Beker would say these are the sort of the fluid and flexible structure that are the background of Paul's thinking. This is what Beker says on page 17, that Jewish apocalyptic is, quote, the substratum and master symbolism of Paul's thought. It is the indispensable filter, context, and grammar by which he interpreted the Christ event. So that is what is coherent for Beker, is that the Christ event isn't just substitutionary atonement, although it might be that. It's not just the death of an innocent person, although it might be that. But that for Paul, the master symbolism behind which Paul understands that Christ event is that it is the beginning of a new age, and that this is sort of drawing on what we know of from other Jewish apocalyptic texts of the first century and before. And what Beker then qualifies in this chapter is that he's not assuming that Paul knew something like the book of Revelation or First Enoch, which is an early Jewish apocalyptic text. Rather, it is certain motifs of apocalyptic that dominate Paul's thinking. He says, again, that coherence is constituted by the apocalyptic interpretation of the death and resurrection of Christ. That's on page 18. And this idea of coherence and the apocalyptic interpretation of the Christ event is really significant. I would say that it sets an entire trajectory in Pauline interpretation that is still active among many specialists in Paul. And there is also a whole stream that reacts to this because it seems as though it is imprecise in Beker. And what are these key motifs that he is selecting for apocalyptic? Would anybody else think of these as key motifs, or is this just the sort of the creative juices of Beker or of any other interpreter? What I think for our purposes is one is to understand what Beker means by coherence, and that it's not quite the same as a single idea or a fixed, stable, static sort of sort of idea. That is really important. And then the second thing for us to engage is whether or not we agree or we like what Beker says about the coherence in Paul's thinking. Does that help us understand Paul's letters better if we think that the sort of central paradigmatic framework for interpreting events is this apocalyptic interpretation of the death and resurrection of Jesus? We sort of went deep into a rabbit hole there, and I hope that you followed with me. And if you didn't, please let me know. Give me some feedback. Help me know what I can clarify later in the week, either in email or another short video lecture, or even in our happy hour session later this week. I want to now turn our attention to hopefully more familiar territory, which is certain connections with our class, certain connections with our questions about Paul as a local theologian. And the first is, I think it's really telling that one of the ways that Beker thinks about the relationship between coherence and contingency is a circular movement. And we just finished talking about the doing theology spiral. So I think that is some low-lying fruit, possibly, of connection. I think that what he says about the Spirit in his chapter, about the Spirit's role in doing theological work for Paul and his communities, is very similar to what later theologians would talk about in terms of experience. Now, I'm not saying that human experience is equated with the Holy Spirit, but I think a lot of the things that he talks about the role of the Spirit or what the Spirit points out, other theologians would liken to experience, which again, we've seen a lot about experience in our class so far, talking about local theology. A third point of connection is this idea that Paul is a, quote, pragmatic hermeneutician, that he is a pragmatic interpreter. Again, I think is very similar to what we've heard about a professional theologian in certain constructs of local theology. And then finally, I really appreciated what Beker says about Paul's work as a consensus-building activity in the body of Christ. Because again, that I think connects with some models that we've experienced of local theology where all Christians are recognized as theologians, and perhaps the formal or professional theologian has a particular role in that community. Well, that is probably too much information, too much down into the rabbit hole with Beker's piece, but I hope that it has clarified a few things about that piece, and hopefully also gives us some language and vocabulary for continuing to analyze Paul and his letters and to think about him as a theologian and maybe as a local theologian. Thank you so much, as always, for your time and your attention.